Good evening and welcome to all of you joining us this evening for the annual Fiori Lecture on Material Culture. In addition to those of you here in person, almost 200 people are registered to attend online. My name is Brenda Lawson and I'm currently serving as the interim president of the MHS. The Fiori Lecture began in 2019 in recognition of President Emeritus Dennis Fiori for his leadership of the MHS from 2006 to 2007. Dennis is with us tonight and will introduce Dr. Ashli White momentarily. Tonight's lecture begins a series of public programs focused on the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to my former boss, Dennis Fiori.
I'm sure Brenda's doing a much better job than I did. I'm glad to be here. I was saying to someone earlier, I'm glad this is honorary rather than in memory of. I thought that was but I first want to thank all, maybe online, maybe here, who gave generously to underwrite this lecture. It was a great honor and a great way to leave the Historical Society. They asked if what I wanted the lecture series to be on was anything in particular, and I immediately said material culture. I come from a background of material culture. My first job was running a place with all artifacts. The second had half artifacts, half archival, and then I came here, which was all archival. So I spent the whole time, not the whole time, but a lot of the time beefing up that aspect of this institution because it has a wonderful artifact collection. Small, but wonderful, and looking to beef it up. I was pleased to see a painting that we bought when I was here on exhibit upstairs. I particularly wanted to make additions in landscape, which I thought we needed to do. So here we are, again, talking about material culture. And this evening, we have a lecturer that's going to inform us about French material culture in the revolutionary Atlantic. Ashli White specializes in early American history with particular attention to the connections between North America and the Atlantic world. To date, most of her research has concentrated on the political, social, and cultural history of the Age of Revolutions. Her most recent book, Revolutionary Things, examines the circulation of objects associated with the American, French, and Haitian revolutions, and it analyzes how these things drew diverse actors into debates over freedom, equality, and solidarity in uniquely visceral and provocative ways. In support of this project, Ashli has received fellowships from the American Council for Learned Societies and the National Endowment for the Humanities, among others. So I'm pleased that we have tonight Ashli White.
Thank you, Dennis, for that kind introduction. It's a real honor to be lecturing in front of somebody for whom a series is named. And thank you all for coming out tonight. I understand there's a baseball game going on, and so there's competition. You could be doing something else, but thanks for coming and learning some more about material culture here today. All right, so the Marquis de Lafayette's 1824-1825 tour of the United States was a sensation. Marquis de Lafayette's 1824-25 tour of the United States, it was a sensation. At every stop on his visit through all 24 states, residents staged fetes to honor the man hailed as the hero of two worlds. Festivities ranged from the humble to the elaborate, but no matter the level of extravagance, the public celebrations precipitated a windfall of objects. Officials offered Lafayette gifts that commemorated his role in independence. Everyday people dusted off relics from the Revolution to display with pride. Lafayette laid cornerstones and new memorials to revolutionary leaders and events. And enterprising American and European manufacturers rolled out an array of Lafayette-themed wares that men and women bought as souvenirs to mark the occasion. These celebrations of Lafayette and the objects integral to them sought to craft a triumphant interpretation of the American Revolution on the eve of its 50th anniversary, a narrative that looked to unify a nation at a tumultuous time. Lafayette's journey coincided with the controversial presidential race between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, and the problem of slavery increasingly divided the nation. In this uneasy political climate, venerating Lafayette was something on which all camps could agree, and Lafayette's generous reactions to these displays were read as an endorsement that the United States was making good on the principles that had animated its revolution. Objects related to his visit helped to fold this validation into the landscapes, homes, and wardrobes of some 19th century Americans. But this moment marks only one occasion of Lafayette's, and by extension, France's influence on American material culture. Lafayette's biography provides us with an opportunity to trace a longer history of the political significance of French things, from the US Revolution to his 1820s tour. Several categories of objects could fit this bill, but this evening we will take inspiration from Lafayette's military career and focus on uniforms. The military was central to his political activism and his sense of self from the 1770s until the end of his life. And during the Age of Revolutions, he frequently chose to wear and was almost always depicted in uniform. But as Lafayette and many others discovered, uniforms were sites of ideological contest. On one level, the politicization of military clothing is obvious. From the choice of color to various insignia, uniforms were designed to broadcast the allegiance of the wearer and to encourage a sense of common cause among fellow soldiers. Lafayette knew this well. On a return visit to France during the American Revolution, Lafayette wore the uniform of an American major general, notably not a French one, at an audience with Louis XVI at Versailles, broadcasting his affiliation for all, including his monarch, to see. In the earliest days of the French Revolution, he designed the uniform for the new National Guard. As the leader of this new army, Lafayette saw their clothing as a way for men to embody and to project the values of Republican France. There is another equally powerful political component to uniforms, one that derives from their being textiles. Uncovering this layer of meaning requires an examination of the social practices surrounding textiles in this period and how they took on distinctive features in the military realm. So this evening, we will consider the value of clothing, its mode of acquisition by soldiers, and finally, what soldiers actually wore. While Lafayette was a general whose status was underscored through his uniform, he, along with all officers in the Revolutionary Wars, was deeply concerned with the clothing of common soldiers. And it's among common soldiers where we see, most strongly, how uniforms offered opportunities to deploy the language of rights. Specifically, and perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, soldiers found through military clothing a means to agitate for equality. It is important to locate this material politicization of uniforms, which informed Lafayette's experience and that of many other soldiers, not just for the American and French revolutions, but for the Haitian Revolution as well. Although Lafayette did not participate in the Haitian Revolution, the Caribbean was very much in his sights, as were the issues of freedom and equality for Black people that were central to the campaign there. During the American Revolution, Lafayette expressed to Washington and others his concerns about slavery, and he interacted frequently with Black soldiers. In the 1780s, he joined the French Abolition Society, Amis des Noirs, and bought a plantation in French Guiana to experiment with mechanisms from transitioning from enslaved to paid laborers. So while Lafayette's moniker may have been the hero of two worlds, he was enmeshed in a wider Atlantic world. And as a result, we need to broaden our view to comprehend the full ideological potential and limitations of uniforms in a revolutionary age. So first, the value of textiles. When the United States declared independence, leaders knew that any hope of success in the war with Britain depended on access to supplies from European countries. The pressure was immense. Because of centuries of mercantilist policies, the 13 colonies lacked the infrastructure to produce enough war materiel. As early as 1775, John Adams, I hear you know him well, he made a very long list of what was needed: guns, gunpowder, shot, cannon, but also cloth for ship sails, tents, flags, and uniforms. Although many 18th century North American households made textiles for domestic consumption, the level of production could not match the demands of war. In the case of uniforms, common soldiers were issued garments annually and sometimes more frequently because of the wear and tear wrought by warfare. During the US, French, and Haitian revolutions, governments measured clothing by the millions, with totals for single items, shirts, stockings, hats, tallying into the millions. I know this is not a good photo, but I wanted to show it to you. It is from the National Archives at Kew, and I am trying to hold open a very large page, which is about this big of a chart, and I'm trying to zoom in. And if you look across that top column, you will see different categories of soldiers and different types of things. And over you'll see privates, which would be common soldiers on the right. And you can see just the numbers for one shipment totaling into the thousands, right? So there are several of these huge seats just for the British Army. So you can multiply this by US, French, and Haitian, and you get a sense of the scale of clothes that's moving through the Atlantic. It's hugely impressive, even if the slide is not. Okay. All right, so without the ability to manufacture the necessary quantities of cloth, North American and Caribbean revolutionaries relied heavily on European imports. When Lafayette first joined the US war effort, he anticipated the constant pressure for military garments, and he lobbied for France to send uniforms, and even paid for and oversaw the shipment of thousands of them. This contribution was remarked on often during his 1820s tour, that this is something he contributed to the war effort. But the fog of war disrupted the flow of clothing. Enemy ships attacked supply vessels. Shipmasters had a hard time keeping abreast of the movements of regiments and delivered consignments to the wrong place. Wagons broke down in lousy weather, and on and on. This reliance on exported cloth and clothing, and the literal and figurative lengths one had to go to procure them, added to the value of these garments for those who acquired them. What's more, in contrast to the disposability of garments today, individuals in the early modern period had fewer articles of clothing because cloth, especially for items like coats, was expensive, even in peacetime. Textiles were prized by people of all walks of life, and this fundamental understanding of value carried over into a military context. In fact, during the Age of Revolutions, military-issued garments were more commonly called clothing than uniforms, because what men wore on the battlefield was not so far removed from the ordinary apparel of free men. I know, a little bit wry, but nevertheless. All right. By mid-century, the suit, a coat, breeches, a waistcoat, was the norm, and military uniforms drew on this familiar form. The parity between civilian and military garments enhanced their worth for a soldier because, unlike other army-issued items, he took his clothing with him at the conclusion of his service. The economic impact of these garments was most substantial for Black soldiers. Right, for centuries, the master class enforced the status of enslaved people through dress. On Atlantic plantations, masters dispensed to Black men a few items yearly, a couple of shirts and trousers, or enough fabric to sew them, usually of cheap, coarse material. The deliberate choice of inferior material and the absence of culturally significant items like coats, hats, and shoes underscored the degraded station of an enslaved person. Sometimes household slaves and coachmen acquired better articles and casts off from masters' families, and whenever possible, enslaved people supplemented their meager apparel with items bought from market stores and traveling salesmen. In some colonies, sumptuary laws buttressed racial and sartorial hierarchies. Free people of African descent and the enslaved were prohibited from wearing certain garments of specific materials, as white men and women feared the challenges clothing could pose to racist notions of white superiority. So given this context, military garments represented an economic and social boon for Black men in the Age of Revolutions. Although the benefit for Black soldiers was impressive, clothing mattered to common white men too. Sometimes the rank and file were caricatured as dregs of mankind. That's a quote. Yet its actual composition was diverse, with large numbers of artisans filling out the ranks. And here you can see a kind of satirical print about the recruits from Britain. If you notice of the men lined up on the right, some of them even have toes poking out of their shoes, right? The contrast between the clothing of the soldiers and those of the new recruits are quite clear. 18th century free men had a greater number and variety of garments compared to earlier generations. The average wardrobe of a Parisian artisan, for instance, consisted of between 15 and 20 principal articles, whereas in the previous century, a craftsman had 2 or 3 changes of daytime clothing. Even with this marked growth, the addition of an entire new suit every year represented a considerable increase for a poor or middling white man. When considering the value of clothing, it's worth noting that military clothing was not free. And this brings us to our second consideration about uniforms, their mechanism of acquisition. Officers like Lafayette were responsible for buying their garments upon accepting their commissions. But because a common soldier lacked the wherewithal to equip himself from head to toe, he agreed to the garnishing of his wages to defray the cost of his attire. In other words, Black and white soldiers bought their clothing from army suppliers and agents, which meant that they had rights to it as owners. This distinction is important because in the civilian world, textiles were imbued with unique traits of possession. Some societies attached textile ownership to the person who wore it, including to married women and the enslaved who lacked legal claims to other forms of property. And this ownership gave wearers and buyers the ability to exercise particular rights, to sell, to trade, to gift, to alter. This consensus around textile rights did not change the legal standing of the enslaved or of married women. But in a military and revolutionary context, it had political prospects for Black and white men, given the mechanisms through which garments were obtained. All common soldiers were quick to defend their right to military clothing because it was one of the few tangible aspects of their pay. During the Revolutionary Wars, each army sent a daily wage rate for soldiers, but they rarely saw any of it in specie. Compensation was gobbled up by deductions for provisions, contributions to the hospital, commissions to the unit's agent, and clothing, among other commitments. Administrators ascribed a monetary value to each garment so that governments and men knew the exact amounts subtracted from a soldier's wages. Congress annually set prices for the Continental Army. In 1778, a coat was valued at $25, a vest at $9, a shirt at $8, breeches at $10. Officials devised elaborate organizational charts for tracking these deductions, like the one I showed you earlier, but in practice, systems were chaotic. In 1780, when a commission investigated the British Army's finances, it found the bureaucratic labyrinth around pay so impenetrable that the committee, as one scholar has described it, quote, abandoned its task with despair. I like that idea of bureaucracy getting him down. All right, so the upshot was that clothing was the most concrete evidence of wages that a soldier witnessed. It was material and valuable, it belonged to him, and it lasted longer than a meal. Notably, the chain of command recognized this prerogative, one of the few. Whether fighting for or against revolution, common soldiers relinquished many rights, submitting to military law and to the orders of their superiors. Men resented and tested these constraints, yet they had little leverage since with enlistment, they consented to military authority. But the arrangement with clothing established an obligation. Since a soldier paid for his garments, the military had a duty to deliver them and in a timely manner. When clothing did not arrive at the designated time, commanding officers took soldiers' grievances seriously. So in March 1777, Captain Robert Kirkwood of the Continental Army read to his men a letter from headquarters, in which he said, "The general is very sorry there should be so much foundation for the frequent complaints of the soldiers respecting their pay and clothing. He is very sensible to these difficulties and promises them everything in his power to have them speedily redressed." Now, perhaps the men found some humor in the unintentional pun about speedy redressing, right? Yeah, I know. But the letter's phrasing is revealing for its recognition of the justness of the soldiers' complaints and an express commitment to do something about them. The Caribbean theater shows the degree to which this acceptance of a soldier's right to clothing proliferated in the Army. After the American Revolution, the Carolina Corps of Loyalist and mostly black troops was reassigned to Grenada and served throughout the Leeward Islands. Governor Edward Matthew insisted that the men be paid and clothed as they had been during the U.S. War of Independence. This directive sparked debate among some white planters because of the perceived threat to racial hierarchies. Nevertheless, Matthew enforced the standard, albeit with mixed results. In 1788, he protested to superiors that for 3 years his men had been paid for, yet not received their clothing. The Treasury agreed to supply the garments. However, 2 years later, agents for the unit pressed officials for the outstanding balance. On the one hand, the case of the Carolina Corps points to how the right to clothing pervaded the military to such an extent that it applied to black soldiers. On the other hand, it illustrates the frustrations and limited recourse of officers and men when shipments of clothing did not appear, a constant problem for all armies during the age of revolutions. The Haitian Revolutionary General Toussaint Louverture sent numerous missives to higher-ups, pleading for clothing for his soldiers. In one, he said, "It is very painful for a commander who has seen his forces endure thirst and hunger and be exposed to the greatest dangers to expel the British from the territory of Saint-Domingue. It is painful, I repeat, to behold these very soldiers deprived of even such basic clothing as would cover their nudity." Racism exacerbated the situation of black soldiers, yet deficient clothing stock affected troops in all armies. While at Valley Forge, Lafayette learned that a shipment of uniforms had arrived from France but was delayed at Yorktown. In an appeal to the quartermaster, he tried to make light of the holdup and urged their transport north by comparing the parcels of clothing to, quote, "innocent strangers who are very desirous of meeting the regiments they belong to." Humor went only so far in placating needy soldiers, however, and some officers tried to diffuse soldiers' exasperation through appeals to sacrifice. After Toussaint Louverture wrote yet another letter about inadequate provisions, the colony's commissioner, Léger Félicité Sothenax, regaled the general with episodes from the American and French revolutions, when poorly equipped and outnumbered soldiers emerged victorious. He urged Louverture to, quote, "remind the Republicans under your command of these heroic traits." According to Sothenax, deprivation was part and parcel of wars against despotism, but such explanations had their limits among soldiers, and intractable lack of clothing led to protest. John Robert Shaw joined a U.S. soldiers' march in Philadelphia to express, quote, our grievances such as no pay, no clothing, without which we could serve no longer. That demonstration was successful, but others not so lucky. On a march in the winter of 1776, General Lee lost about 2,700 men out of 3,000 by desertion for want of clothing, he explained. So repeated clothing shortfalls offered opportunities for common soldiers to assert their rights. But their sense of rights went beyond mere acquisition to include a keen understanding of quality. When clothing shipments were delivered, soldiers were not content to accept just any garment. They knew that not all shirts, for instance, were alike, and these differences in condition mattered. The better the shirt, the longer it lasted, and the more a soldier felt he got the value he deserved. When the American soldier Joseph Plum Martin traveled with his lieutenant to retrieve clothing for their unit, his superior officer told him, quote, take care of my own interest. I accordingly picked from the best of each article that was allowed to each man and bundled them up by themselves. So men expected the garments to reflect the degree of quality for which they paid, and they objected to inferior goods, at times refusing to accept them on principle. As one soldier described it, some garments were, quote, not fit for the devil to wear. The persistent problems with clothing black and white soldiers and the dogged discrepancies between paid for and distributed garments leads us to our final area of consideration: what soldiers actually wore. While soldiers' uniforms were already freighted with political implications because of the value of clothing and the manner of their procurement, these garments take on greater significance when we examine their lived reality. Posing this question is easier than answering it, because although armies kept records about the articles soldiers were supposed to get, they did not record what men did wear. Nor do many garments worn by the rank and file survive. The most consistent source is advertisements for deserters. And so I built a database from the largest available cache of about 250 cases from North America between 1776 and 1783. This glimpse of their sartorial reality reveals the extent to which they could and could not leverage the ideological power of military clothing. So let's focus on coats, which were the most prized article in both economic and social terms, because they were the most expensive and the most prominent garments for military and civilian men. In a military context, they were essential to the coveted ideal of sartorial uniformity, even as they bore the weight of honorifics that signaled rank and other distinctions. Over half of the deserter advertisements used the term regimental, soldier, regular, or uniform to denote a coat with military provenance. The rest were distinguished by known types, like frock fashion or surtout, by cut, long, short, straight-bodied, by notable features, like quilting. All of these were found in civilian dress, too. The predominant color of coats when noted was blue, but many were brown, and there were a smattering of greens, grays, and even reds. About a quarter of the coats were turned up with contrasting colors at the collar, lapels, or cuffs. These were all signs of military sartorial distinction. A slim majority of coats were made of the preferred fabric broadcloth, but there were also coats of homespun, blanket, calico, linen, and shag, among others, which I would like to see, the shag in particular. All right. This brief overview shows the diversity among soldiers' most noticeable garment, the one that was intended to give them collectively a homogeneous look. Some of this variety resulted from differences between regiments, but it can be found within individual units as well. Of the 4 deserters from Captain Park's company, each man wore a different coat. One was light-colored, faced with blue. Another was blue uniform, faced with red. One was simply short, light-colored. And the last was a British regimental dyed brown with white edging. Moreover, soldiers paired semi-conformable coats with non-regulation garments. Brown regimental coat with striped waistcoat, or a blue one with brown and linen breeches. You get the idea. So in the context of this variegated and often distressed clothing landscape, encounters with men who realized the martial sartorial ideal, or even key components of it, resonated strongly. With so few men dressed in the regulation uniforms for which they paid, those who managed the feat broadcast political statements bolder than we have realized. Men in full uniform claimed the economic, social, and cultural values imbued in those textiles, which among civilians announced their entitlements as owners, and within the army demanded an equality of station, a right to be treated like any other member of their rank. The political import was most radical for men of African descent, given the material and ideological degradation that accompanied slavery and racism, and how some revolutionaries challenged both. We might expect sartorial brilliance among the leading Black officers from the Haitian Revolution. Toussaint Louverture, Henry Christophe, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, among others, were often portrayed in complete and impressive military regalia. Even more striking are accounts of common soldiers in full uniform. At times, these depictions reflect the status of white men more than that of the Black men pictured. So consider this engraving, which Lafayette commissioned to celebrate the victory at Yorktown. As the general gestures to the successful battle in the background, a Black servant holds Lafayette's horse at the ready. He wears a fanciful ensemble, including a plaid sash wrapped around his waist, an enormous hat topped with feathers, and a bright earring. Scholars posit that this person is James Armistead, an enslaved man who gathered intelligence for Lafayette during the Yorktown campaign and was manumitted in 1787 on the basis, in part, of Lafayette's testimony of his exemplary service. But in this rendition, Armistead's sartorial grandeur is associated with Lafayette. Despite the real dangers he faced, his expensive and impractical clothing, especially for surreptitious intelligence gathering, right, all right, that casts him as nearer to livery than to a soldier, right? And this was an actual practice as well as a pictorial convention across the Atlantic world. And I'm sure you've seen this Washington print. These were meant to be as a pair, and you can see Washington with Billy Lee in the background. There's a kind of mirroring between Lafayette and Washington here in both of these French prints. These kinds of portrayals tried to contain the political impact of Black soldiers in full uniform. But this was impossible out in the field as soldiers met. Diarists, admittedly all white, appraised the clothing of the Black rank and file, even noting instances when they had a more martial appearance than their white peers. So you've seen this. Jean-Baptiste Antoine de Verger, a sub-lieutenant of the Royal du Point regiment in what is now Switzerland, he sketched these four soldiers. A Black infantryman from the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, a musketeer from the 2nd Canadian Regiment, an American rifleman, and a gunner from the Continental Artillery, moving from left to right. Among the four men, the white rifleman deviates the most from the martial model. The side view shows off not only his unorthodox hunting shirt, but also his pouch, axe, powder horn, and very long rifle. While the attire of the Black soldier differs from that of all three white men, those differences stem from distinctions of his unit. He, more so than the rifleman, exemplifies military aspirations in his clothing and accoutrement, equal in sartorial stature and military bearing to the white musketeer and gunner with whom he is pictured. Roget's observation did not circulate outside his journal, yet they, as well as those of others, shed light on the thousands of interactions between Black and white men who sized up one another's clothing on the battlefield, in camp, and on the march. Several images of Black soldiers like those in Marcus Rainsford's 1805, An Historical Account of the Black Empire of Haiti, were published and distributed among audiences located away from the theaters of war. In one plate, which you see here, a black private, who is the lowest ranking soldier in the French Republican Army, is impeccably dressed. From his cockaded and feathered hat and smartly cut coat to his form-fitting breeches and shiny black boots, he radiates martial sophistication. A few eccentricities are meant to signal his Caribbean roots, the large hoop earring and the turban-like shape of the hat. But for anyone, civilian or soldier, seeing the print, it would be hard to deny the fine quality and worth of his garments and his economic and cultural ability to conform to martial sartorial ideals. When white men met uniformed black soldiers in the field, or as images of them moved throughout the Atlantic world, their attire spoke volumes about the wherewithal that was threaded through each garment and of the rights of possession over that clothing. In an age of revolutions, this material statement had political overtones. Free men of African descent who served in the Jamaica militia during the American Revolution expressed this connection overtly. Protesting exclusion from hurricane relief funds, they reminded the Colonial Assembly of their military service. They wrote, quote, "As good citizens and in arms as soldiers, they have always done and are all still ready to do their utmost in defense of the British Constitution." As concrete evidence of their loyalty, they cited their hefty outlay to clothe themselves in regimentals. And for that contribution, they contended they deserved equitable treatment as citizens. To claim equal status via military clothing after centuries of degradation, men of African descent advanced one of the most radical and tangible claims of the age of revolutions. They used military conventions to insist on an equality that few among the master class were ready to accept. Napoleon Bonaparte and his advisors in Saint-Domingue grasped the immense ideological power of black men in uniforms when they decided in 1801 to reinstate slavery on the island. Bonaparte summed up the motivation for the project in sartorial terms. As he put it, he could no longer, quote, "tolerate a single epaulet on the shoulders of black men." Force, however, was the only way to remove them. After all, like the coats on which they were sewn, the epaulets belonged to the black soldiers who wore them. When Lafayette returned to the United States in 1820, you have the slide and the real thing to the right, for those of you who are here. When he returned to the US in the 1820s, he did not wear his uniform from the American Revolution, but plenty of other men he encountered did. The sight of these garments prompted Lafayette to reflect on the revolution and the men who fought for it. While in Roxbury, on his way to Boston, he awoke to the sound of soldiers drilling in front of his window. According to his official chronicler and traveling companion, quote, "The sight of the uniform of this company deeply affected the general, and he exclaimed, 'My brave light infantry, such was their uniform. What courage, how much I love them.'" Lafayette's vocabulary of love and courage glosses over the political controversies that were woven into military garments during the Age of Revolutions, as men throughout the Atlantic world used the capacity of these textiles to argue for equality. To be sure, this material articulation of equality was not the lofty notion enshrined in the Declaration of Independence or the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, although for people of African descent and women, these avowals fell far short. Yet the equality of military clothing was, for many black and white men, concrete and valuable, evident in everyday life, and practical in ways that declarations were not. And in the United States, this contest through uniforms persisted during Lafayette's tour and beyond. Since the conclusion of the war, white and black veterans of the American Revolution had lobbied to receive pensions in recognition of their service and to rectify the fact that their pay, when it was distributed, had been in depreciated, if not worthless, continental paper money. 2 federal acts passed shortly before Lafayette's tour sought to redress this need among veterans, but the initial legislation limited the pool of possible recipients to continental soldiers and only to those who could demonstrate financial need. Militiamen were excluded, and veterans' claims were mired in bureaucracy. So when elderly veterans donned their uniforms to greet Lafayette, they were redeploying the political principles associated with those garments, not just to honor the cause, but also to push for a fuller realization of it by compelling the federal government to deliver on its contractual promise made almost 50 years before. The fight for equality, in short, continued. Our approach tonight to Revolutionary-era military clothing has implications for interpretations of material culture more broadly. There is a tendency to emphasize an object's origin, and often for good reason, since the date of creation, place of origin, and maker, among other attributes, are crucial for understanding an object, right? But this propensity to fixity shapes how we see an object's political significance. In this case, whether a wearer is for or against revolution. But as we have explored tonight via Lafayette, the movement of French things across space and time reminds us that objects have less straightforward, more dynamic, and longer life cycles than we sometimes give them credit for. They became a means of ideological contest, not only during the American Revolution, but also in several moments and places thereafter. This resonance stemmed from their specific characteristics as objects and from who wore them, when, where, how, and to what ends. This is an important observation to keep in mind as we prepare to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. In exhibitions across the country, objects from the Revolution will, no doubt, help us commemorate the spirit of '76. But I hope that they will also be active agents in continuing the unfinished work of Atlantic revolutions, namely the realization of liberty, equality, and justice for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to Dr. White. She has agreed to take a few questions. And I think, do we have somebody with the mic in the back? Or Olivia's taking the mic. All right, all yours.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you so much, Ashley. That was really a wonderful talk. I'm curious your thoughts or any information about a secondhand market for things that would be recognized as elements of a uniform, whether once they're separated from their original owners, they lose any kind of association with the service, whether there's a sense that they gain value because there's a perceived association, or whether there's a sense that they should not circulate in the way that other used clothing would do because they have a kind of aura around them.
That they become more relics in the aftermath rather than, yeah. I think, you know, I'm going to say this, it's both, right? So in the case of the American Revolution, there's a drive early on to begin to collect things associated with the revolution, even if it's fake, like tea from the Boston Tea Party, right? And to preserve those for the nation subsequently. In the French Revolution, many things are destroyed, but there is a scramble actually among individual collectors, historians of the time to grab things from trash pits and to keep them, and to try to document the provenance behind things. Haitian Revolution, a lot harder, right, because of the nature of the revolution and the way that Haiti is ostracized subsequently, and the internal politics within Haiti afterward. But I think in terms of clothing in particular, that because it was still, because of this, textiles in general were valued on the secondhand market. In the 18th century, if you wanted to hold on to something, if you wanted cash in hand and you didn't have cash, you would go for silver or you would go for textiles. They're portable, and lots of people are ready to buy them, right? So you can see it with people who are migrating. If they're looking to run and they've got to take something valuable, that's what they get. And it wouldn't surprise me then, in the case of soldiers, that if they were short on cash after the revolution and they need something to sell and they have a coat, that would end up in circulation, and these things would get modified and mended in the way that we know many 18th century women's gowns would be remade. Even if it was associated with a wedding, right, which maybe you'd want to keep, it would get modified and used. And I actually find that fascinating, and I don't think that the value is diminished by making it more adaptable and everyday for somebody else versus keeping it as a relic, as a standing. I think that points to the enormous capacity of these objects to continue to make meanings in ways that are, in some ways, overtly political tied, but in other ways might have a more immediate and intimate meaning for those who carry them on. So for me, it's all fair game, Joyce. Thank you.
About Deborah Sampson, who so famously served as a Revolutionary War soldier, though a woman. Did she purchase those clothes, and how do you think that all worked out?
I think she would have to have purchased those clothes. That would be part of it. And actually she's a great example about how much the clothing is speaking volumes in its form. Like if you're wearing the part, it makes the masquerade possible, right? And so the clothing was essential. But yes, she too, in order to participate, would have had to buy the clothing.
Question, but something I'd like to share. We have Civil War letters from my husband's great-grandfather. How many? Many greats, great-grandfather, that were destined for the library at Harvard, where his uncle graduated from. But Harvard did not refuse them. They said it really should go to Cornell, because that's the area where the regiment of my husband's great-great-grandfather started his service in the Civil War. I've gone through the letters. I have 3 years of them. They are absolutely fascinating. And they are written in the old script, not easy to read, but my husband's ancestor was literate, which was unusual. So he was he was put as a quartermaster.
Oh.
In the letters to Clarissa, his wife, he wrote a lot. We don't have any of her letters, but we do have one. And to your point, in material culture, she wants his coat. He is freezing. The letters in his handwriting, he can't even, is shaking. His hands are shaking. He has not enough paper. So he writes all around the edges, right? And he said, I would love to give you my coat, Clarissa, but I will die without it. So I wanted to share that.
No, I think absolutely. I mean, it's super practical. I think being a quartermaster is one of the most miserable jobs for the American Revolution, the French Nation, and for the Civil War too, right? Because of the desperate grab for supplies all the time. But I love it. Maybe eventually she got the coat. Poor Clarissa.
Hi, that was a great talk, thank you. And I just wanted to know more about why Lafayette didn't wear his uniform in the 1824 tour? Was it because it was kind of old hat? It had been many years, he didn't fit in anymore? Or was it kind of like what you were saying before of kind of reusing it? Was that something that you would see in kind of the upper classes as well as kind of what you're talking about with the lower classes as well?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't think of evidence explaining, where he explains why he decides not to wear it. I think it would also be tricky in the political moment on a kind of global scale, in that after the French Revolution, Lafayette spends a good deal of time in prison during the French Revolution. Napoleon kind of kicks him out to La Grange. But he becomes active in politics subsequently, more as a civilian, but often he's caricatured in uniform. And I think maybe in the 1820s, he's coming more, he says he's coming in that civilian capacity to visit, right? And I think perhaps given the tense political situation in the US in the 1820s, that's a deliberate move. But my sense too is he has an eye on not just the United States, but also what's unfolding in Europe. I'd be curious if he's thinking about the Caribbean too. But I don't know that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk. I was struck in seeing some of these images, particularly of Haitian revolutionary heroes, by the way that they are, the sartorial display is really quite amazing, and and you see that consistently. Do other sources besides the visual sources bear this out, or is this part of a kind of visual vocabulary? Or what is your sense of the relationship between, obviously, the images that show that, and then what else we might know about what they wore?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You mean written sources? Yeah. Yes. Right. Sorry, Dennis. We're going to go there. So I think yes. So for the leadership. Right? So for your Toussaint Louvertures, your Henri Christophe, your Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and other black officers who for a significant chunk of the Haitian Revolution are serving as part of the French army, right? The French Republican Army, right? From about, let's say, we'll call it 1793 to 1802. And in 1802, then it becomes a war for independence as Bonaparte looks to reinstate slavery. And then Haiti becomes independent in 1804. So we do have documentation that for those officers, they are wearing the clothing that designates their rank, right? It's extraordinarily important for the French Republican cause as it's playing out in the Caribbean, right, at that middle period, let's say, of the Haitian Revolution. And we know subsequently that the leadership of Haiti continues often to dress in this way. It is more difficult to figure out exactly what the rank and file would be wearing. They should be wearing the black soldiers in the French Republican Army in Saint-Domingue during the middle period of the Haitian Revolution. They should be wearing what other French Republican soldiers are wearing. And so when Toussaint Louverture is complaining to Sotonax, and he's writing back to Paris as well, saying, we need these uniforms, it is for practical purposes, right? But it is also for a way of inculcating those principles and sort of making equality on the ground. But the nice little charts that I have for the British, I have not yet seen them for the French in terms of going to Saint-Domingue. Thank you.
One more question? No? Oh, yes, one.
I was noticing in all these pictures, and in some of the pictures you show, the prominence of I'm just noticing the prominence of the white neckwear
Yeah.
and wondering where that started from and what the significance, kind of in your opinion, that white neckwear holds.
I can tell you that Lafayette wanted yellow. That's what he said to Benjamin Franklin. It shouldn't be white, it should be yellow, because he thought it would wear better. So there's this whole, around the design of uniforms, there's all this argument, and Lafayette gets into it. But the white would be sort of the linen underneath, and it was a way of showing cleanliness. It's an indication that also is something that carries over from the civilian world. So if you look at the clothing of middling and elite, the Revere painting where he has that wonderfully white sleeve that's rolled up, like if you were really working, it wouldn't be white. Right? It was a way of distinguishing a kind of status to keep your linens that white in an 18th century world where managing that kind of intensive cleaning is extraordinarily difficult. So time's up. I guess we can check in on the scores in the baseball game for those of you who've been monitoring. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. Thanks, Brenda.
Right. I want to say thank you again to Ashli, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. It is with the support of our members that we are able to offer programs like this one. So if you're not a member already, I invite you to become one. And I look forward to seeing you at a future program or event. And let's give our speaker one more hand and have a good night. Thank you and good night.